Hey there, and welcome back to the Complicated Kids podcast. I'm your host, toddler whisperer, speech therapist, and parent coach, Gabrielle Nicolay. And I'm super excited for our conversation today with Emily Cherkin. Emily, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm going to have you introduce yourself in a second, but you have written a book, and I just want right at the outset to give the title. You have written a book. It was published in January of this year, 2024. The Screen Time Solution, a judgment-free guide to becoming a tech intentional family. And the reason I'm emphasizing tech intentional is because we're going to talk some more about what that means. But if we're going to say judgment-free, then intentionality seems like a really good idea. So
Yeah.
let's jump in. So why did you write this book? And tell us about yourself.
Yeah. So I wrote the book because I think there's a lot of books out there that talk about the screen time problem. And there's a lot of news and media around how tech can be bad. And I wanted to provide a guide for families about what we can actually do about it. So I really tried to focus on the actionable things that parents can think about when we're parenting in the digital age, because it has changed dramatically in the last, I would say 10, but really even 5 years. We've seen a just seismic shift in things. And I decided to write the book in part because I'd been a classroom teacher for 12 years. So I spent 12 years teaching middle school English and sort of a media literacy, social emotional curriculum at the school I was working at. And I just saw this shift from no tech. No kids had phones. Maybe one kid had a flip phone and they were mortified because their parent made them take it, to school. From that, and then 10 years later, it was 95% of my kids had smartphones. And that was at the same time that schools were requiring more tech for teachers as well. So I was starting to put grading and homework online. And I did not like that as a teacher either. That was another challenge. And so I quickly realized that this was a problem that was affecting social dynamics in the school, even if kids were off, they were online out of the school environment in the earlier days, online at computers at home. But it quickly made me realize that we had to talk about it. And so when I talked about it to my students, they were like, yeah, but it's our parents who are texting and driving and scrolling through social media. It's not just us. And I thought, aha, this is an adult problem that is affecting kids, not a kid problem. So I decided to think about it as a way of how to help parents help kids.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I love so much of what you just said, right? The adult problem that affects kids.
Yes.
Because a lot of times what I'll hear, what we hear in our Raising Orchid Kids group, for example, is like, my kid won't get off the phone. And
Yes.
then the question that I usually want to ask is, what are we modeling
Yes.
inadvertently and well-intentioned?
Yep. Yep.
And I have been called on the carpet by my children. So before we hit record, we were talking about our kids a little bit, and my kids are just a little bit older than yours. And I
Mm-hmm.
think we escaped. I have a 21 and an 18-year-old at the time of this recording. We escaped kind of that
Yes.
saturation of media.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so but I am on my phone a lot.
Yes.
I go to take something out of the oven at dinner time. I I push, full disclosure here, I push my phone to see if anybody has texted me.
Yeah.
And my
Yep.
kids will call me out on it. They'll be like, "Ma, it's
Yes.
dinner time."
Yeah. Totally. And I think this is a cultural shift that's both needing to happen and uncomfortable for adults,
Mm.
because it's true. And I hear this all the time. I mean, first of all, we know kids hate hypocrisy. And so one of the things that I think makes parenting in the digital age so hard is that kids are like, well, you're telling me to get off, but you're on your phone or you're on your computer all the time. And again, I always say to parents, this is my judgment free approach. This is hard. I am the first to admit that this is not a perfect, my house has conflict and stress around screens, but it's not our fault as parents, but it is our responsibility. And to me, that's the piece we have to own as parents, to say, okay, yeah, this is hard and I got to do the work, because I mean, quite frankly, I believe we're fighting for our kids' future mental, cognitive, emotional, and physical health when we set limits on screen time.
I think there are researchers who would agree with you.
Yes. Yes, I
So,
tend to cite them. Yep.
so what's so bad about screens? Or let me phrase that a different way,
Yeah.
because we're not here to vilify screens, but
Right.
what are the things about humans around screens that are
Yeah.
problematic?
Well, I always say I am not anti-tech, I'm tech intentional. And part of what that includes is the recognition that screen time is this catch-all phrase for so many different things. I
Mm,
can say, FaceTiming with grandma is a very different experience than scrolling through TikTok videos, right? In terms of what it's doing to our brains and our relationships and our, emotions. And so it is tricky when we lump all of screen time into one category.
mhm.
There are good indicators, and there is new research and emerging research about longer term impacts. I mean, initially when I started this work, we just didn't have the research yet because it was such a new phenomenon. But we do know, for example, that the earlier children have access to devices, the more problematic the use is later. We do know that children from certain demographics, lower income, tend to spend more time on the internet. And there are all kinds of nuances to this, which is why when I paraphrase what I mean by tech intentional, I have a very quick TLDR, which means too long, don't read, which is later is better, less is more, relationships first. That if you want to be tech intentional, those are the things we have to focus on because there are certainly people on one end of the spectrum that will say all screen time is evil and bad. I mean, it's the rot your brain generation, even now magnified. And there are a few families who really toe that line. And you know what? More power to them. I wish them well. That's challenging in and of itself. But then on the flip side, it's the free for all families who are like, oh, this is the future. This is what kids do now. And I'm not on either end of that. It is much more nuanced than that. And if you are a human who knows a child, you know that no two children are alike. And so you can't apply a one size fits all solution to this problem when children are not standardized. They are unique.
I am so happy that you said that last piece. No, because it
Yeah.
gets lost in all of the different parenting conversations these
Yeah.
days. Apply this to everything.
Yeah.
Bedtime, feeding,
Yeah.
extracurriculars.
Oh,
Screen time is but one area that has been a little bit
yes.
weaponized
Yes.
of like,
Yes.
you're a good parent if you do this,
Yeah.
but you're a terrible
Right.
parent if you do that. And that is not, I think, what
No.
either of us is here to do. And
No.
your rules, your policies, your ideas, your limits, your whatevers are
Yep.
going to change based on
Yes.
who's in front
Yes.
of you.
Yes.
So my
Yes.
kids, right? Like one of my kids can totally handle 2 hours
Yes.
of like movie time
Yep.
in the middle of the afternoon. And the other one of my kids couldn't handle that. And guess what?
Exactly. Right.
No.
Right. And again, I'm so glad you mentioned that this is about all kinds of areas of parenting, right? I always joke that parenting is the judgiest sport I've ever played because it doesn't matter what it's like sleep and feeding and all of this stuff. And this is why I start my book, I start my talks with replace judgment with curiosity because it isn't what works for you isn't going to work for the next family. And I try to convey that in the book and in the work I do that like you may have a solution that works for you, but that doesn't mean it's going to work for everybody else. It may not even work for your second and third and fourth kid. And that's why the nuance piece is so important. And so, again, to go back to my TLDR, if you can kind of fold it into that general summary of less is more, later is better, and relationships first, chances are you're going to get through it.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
just going to look a little different for each family. And
Right.
that's okay.
Yeah. Tell me more about later is better and what the research shows on that.
Yeah. So there was research just in JAMA, and I can send you the link for your notes too about that study. But really, what they found, and this is sort of in that birth to 5 range, which, as you know, is like huge brain development, huge things happening, that children who had 2 or more hours of screen use a day in that window did perform poorly or less well on psychological factors, right?
Okay.
Flourishing compared to kids who had 1 hour or less a day. And what's interesting to me about that data is that it's not absolute. It's saying, and this a little bit is okay, and a lot is too much, is another thing I say all the time with a caveat that, again, it depends on the kid.
Right.
And so I do think sometimes parents feel like when there are too strict parameters around total number of hours and they've not met that, they feel like they've already failed. So there's no incentive to change or shift. Again, I'm always going to go back to just less is more, later is better. So they're getting some screen time under an hour here and there, throughout the week. I don't think that's an ultimate crisis, with, again, a few exceptions, right? We know there are a few kids for whom that's not going to work. And there's a few kids who might have more than 2 hours a day and just be fine at age 5. Again, if we err on the side of less is more, then we just keep it within that range. It's better. There's also things we can do as parents, right? Co-viewing, media literacy, talking about what we're seeing, what's happening, connecting it to real world experiences. When this character behaves that way, has that ever happened in your friendship circle, right? Like, ways to connect it so that it's part of the learning. Now, I'm not advocating for extra screen time for kids to do that, but that's sort of where I land on the how much is too much question.
Yeah. And so that sounds like that study in particular was geared at very young children.
Yes.
What's happening, like if we fast forward a little bit to the teen
Yes.
scale, because I've seen some interesting summary, I haven't read the research myself, on kind of a linear relationship between acquisition of phone and mental health.
Yes.
You want to talk about that a little bit?
Definitely. I mean, for a long time, people in my field were saying there is a connection here, like it's sort of duh, right? And this is work that Jonathan Haidt, Lenore Skenazy, Jean Twenge, these are all researchers who've now documented this evidence that it's causational, not just correlational. The age at which a child gets a phone, the younger the age, the worse the mental health later, right? Again, there's always exceptions to this, but that's generally what they found. The other thing that I think is really important is that kids are getting phones younger and younger. Like, we know that. We know, I think it's about 33% of 8-year-olds have smartphones. We're talking, we're talking 70% of 12-year-olds. Yeah, I mean, and as we started talking before the recording, one of the things that we know is that development is being severely impacted in a lot of ways, right? Certainly COVID and pandemic life impacted families and relationships, all that. I'm not going to say that didn't have an impact. However, at the same time, more tech for school, parents trying to work, parents needing childcare or supervision and using screens to do that. This whole, mixing pot of challenges got thrown in there. So kids are sort of hitting maturity later. At the same time, they're getting devices younger. I hear a lot from middle school teachers who, especially in the years after COVID, have said kids are coming in as as 8th graders, bodies are 8th grade, emotional skills, social skills are 6th grade. So you've got this mismatch in development. At the same time, we're handing over these devices that are internet connected. And one thing I always like to talk about is Pew Research has found that the top 3 parental fears in America right now, number 3 is kidnapping, which is fascinating to me because kidnapping is statistically so rare, like almost nil. It's certainly stranger kidnapping. And yet, I hear all the time, my kid needs a phone to be safe. So they give their kids phones. And again, no judgment here. If this is you, this is reporting what I hear, and I'm going to invite you to think of it differently because you give the phone in the name of safety. But do you know what the number 1 and number 2 parental fears in America are? Cyberbullying and mental health. So what happens is that when we give the phone in response to our fear about kidnapping, we actually make the parental fear number 1 and number 2 way worse, right? So it's a complete miss of what's scary versus what's really dangerous is how I phrase it.
I want to point out 2 things about what you just said.
Yes.
One is a general thing, which is when we as parents do anything from fear, we almost always make the wrong choice.
Yes.
So when we are afraid that our 8-year-old will be abducted and we give them a phone, to your point, we are basically ensuring that they will have mental health problems, according to the research, right? And that we're basically increasing the likelihood that they're going to be bullied because they're immature. There are immature people online. Okay, fine.
Yep.
In the same way, when we are afraid that our kids won't do well at school, we hound them, and that
Mm-hmm.
makes them less likely to want to do well at school.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there's this like we get the inverse of what we intend when we act
Yeah.
from fear. And I think that,
Yeah.
first of all, that applies to humanity generally, but it really
Yeah.
applies in parenting. And
Yes.
so much of parenting, particularly older children, I think, but maybe this is just me, so much of parenting children is about examining one's own fears
Yes.
and dismantling them so that we can actually do the work of parenting.
Amen. I always joke no one got into parenting because they heard it'd be easy, right? Like
Right.
if it were easy, we wouldn't have parenting coaches and books on parenting, right? Like it's work. It's the hardest job I've ever had. And I taught middle school for 12 years, right? Like this is real. And, Lenore Skenazy talks about worst first thinking as that has become instinctual or feels instinctual, that we go to worst case scenario. Well, what if, what if, what if? And it takes an incredibly courageous parent in this day and age to say, I'm not going to give in to that thinking. But at the same time that we're, sucked in by the fear, we are consuming 24/7 news headlines and social media feeds that reinforce the misguided perception that the world is a dangerous place.
Yeah.
So therein becomes that modeling piece as a parent too. I will choose to get my news in limited doses. I will not doom scroll at night. I will make decisions rooted in child development, not in fear. And that takes a lot of work on our end as parents.
A ton of work and a ton of self-awareness. And,
Yes.
To be honest, the system is rigged against that.
Yep.
And honestly, our own neurology is rigged against that because
Yeah.
we do have this negativity bias. This
Totally.
I love that, worst first thinking, right?
Yes.
In order to stay alive, which if you're a cave dweller serves you really well. If you are
Right.
living in 2024 in a city and not, out in the middle of the wilderness by yourself, it
Yeah.
is less useful. And so I recently had Camilo Ortiz on the podcast,
Yes.
who wrote a
I
piece
know of her.
of him. Yeah.
Him.
Camilo. He wrote a piece in the New York Times about anxiety.
Yes, that's where I've heard it. Okay.
Yeah. And about how anxiety, we're not getting rid of anxiety.
No.
So we should get over, we have the opportunity to get over ourselves with the anxiety already.
Yeah.
Which is not the same as saying that anxiety is easy. It's not. It's hard. But it's also necessary at times and mostly not necessary now. But and so we get this hijack effect.
Yes.
And then the news media is trying to sell us something, and
Yes.
social media is designed specifically. And if you haven't seen, what's the documentary called?
Social Dilemma.
The Social Dilemma. Is that what it's called?
Was that the real one or the most recent one? There's also Childhood 2.0.
Yeah, a Social Dilemma. But the Social Dilemma, where they're like literally creating the algorithm to keep you glued in. And there isn't any choice when your dopamine system has been hijacked like that. You're actually not choosing to stay. It's a very, it's not fair.
It's so funny you say that, because I literally say to parents, it's not a fair fight. It is not you versus your child. When it comes to turning off the screen time, it's you versus a hijacked neural pathway, and you're not going to beat it. You versus dopamine. Dopamine is going to win. And so what we have to think about, and this is for parenting around the screen piece, no matter what age of the child, taking space away more often than not results in a disproportionate reaction to, it'd be different if it was, I'm taking away your Lego or I'm taking away your book. It's the screen. And that again is because it is engineered to manipulate our focus and attention and make us feel good about how much time we spend on it. And so when we take that away, we are interrupting that flow of feel good hormones. And, how many adults, I always do this in my talks, how many adults have trouble turning off your phone at night or saying, I'm just going to watch one more episode? Or, you close your email and you immediately open it again because you might have a new message. That is persuasive design, right? It is If it is hard for us and we have fully formed prefrontal cortices, I'm not sure what the plural is. If we have those, we expect children to be able to figure this out. They
That's right.
absolutely developmentally cannot. So that's where I get real mad.
I agree with you 100%. And that is where, right, I mean, there is no must, there is no should, but I do feel
Right.
like there is a mandate if we are adults in charge of our children's environment, which we are for some amount of time, to step up to the task of understanding how these things work and of cleaning up whatever's happening for us so that we can teach habits. Okay, so the next question I want to ask you, because you and I could go all day long about like,
we could. A lot of that's in my book, by the way. I do dive into it. So that hopefully will be a resource for people who want more.
Yeah, and we'll link to the book, obviously, because I think this is going to be a really important book for people to have.
Yeah, thank you.
Give us like a couple of nuggets and maybe throughout a kid's lifespan of like, what can we do?
Right. I know this is a question I get all the time, but how do I handle this? So the very first tip I give, and this is from birth to 99, this is a skill, a strategy that I think anyone can do today, and it's called living your life out loud. And so all this means is that as we use tech in any capacity, we narrate what we do as we do it. And so that is, I'm reaching for my phone, I'm opening my app, I'm looking at what the weather says. Now I'm going to go and check and see what time soccer practice ends. And then I got to text your friend to find out if they're going to meet us. Just this play by play, as one parent told me. Is it annoying? Yes. Does it teach the children around us how we use our devices? Yes, because these are multi-tools, not Swiss Army. They're Swiss Army knives, not switchblades, is what I like to say. And of course, to a child who only ever sees the back of our device, they have no idea what we're doing on there. So this is such a useful, and yes, I mean with infants too. I'm picking up my phone. Can I take your picture? Can your 4-month-old say yes or no? Of course not. But what are you doing? You're modeling that someone has to ask permission to take a photo. You are modeling how we use it as a tool. And then, of course, there is going to come a day, an age when the child says, no, you can't. And that is when we put it down and we say, okay, I appreciate your honesty. Thank you for telling me. Now, parents always go, oh my gosh, that sounds like a lot of work. It's once you start that habit, it's easy. It's free. You don't need to download an app. You don't need special training. Your parenting, your co-parent or parent partner or spouse is going to start noticing when your kids roll their eyes, you know it's working.
Excellent. When your kids roll their eyes, you know it's working. That is a catchphrase for all of parenting. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. And we can't take it personally because we need them to hear this over and over and over again. And again, I'm a big fan of 80-20 parenting. It's 80% of the time we're parenting the way we want. We are not perfect. We're going to mess up. But in my mind, that's more opportunity for teachable moments too. Like, you know, if your kid calls you out on your screen use, why aren't you living your life out loud, Mom? Thank you for the reminder. You're right. I forgot to do it.
I love this.
We have to reinforce it too, because I notice it even with my 16-year-old who does have his own phone now, but he'll say, I'm reaching for my phone. I'm going to text my friend about a homework assignment. And I'll say, thank you for living your life out. Because what do I want to do? I want to reinforce the behavior that I want to see. It's so easy to, you know, like you said, focusing on that negativity. It's the easy thing to do when we respond to. But I want that energy to go to the positive, where energy goes, what is it? Where attention goes, energy flows, right? So I want to focus on those behaviors I want to see more of.
Okay, so narrating. Oh my God, never thought of that. Love it.
Yeah, live your life out loud. Just live your life out loud. And, you know, PS, it's great executive function skill building. It's just a great way to teach kids about the steps that we take in a process and planning and all of that. Yeah. So side bonus.
Love. Okay, what else? Give us another one.
So that's one. Another one is get your phone out of your bedroom. Parents. Alarm clocks are super cheap. They're not necessarily connected to the internet. That's because that's the number one thing I always hear is it's my alarm clock. I have an old school alarm clock. It works. It does make a loud, obnoxious noise. And it decreases my scrolling before bed. It's not the first thing I reach to in the morning. And more importantly, when I tell my teenager they can't have his phone in his room at night, he can't say, well, that's not fair, you do.
That's right.
So that's a huge one. It's low hanging fruit. It's good for all of us. And it's modeling what we want from our kids. So, even baby step it, put it on the other side of your bedroom to start, put it in the hallway outside, like just make that effort.
I will say one of the things we did in our family early on, and again, my kids are a little bit older, so they were not born, nor was, they were not born seeing me with the phone in my hand.
Right.
But during dinner and as of X o'clock, and that time changed, phones in the table. We have a specific piece of furniture where everybody has a drawer for their wallet, their keys, and their phone. And the charger charges to there. So when you plug it in, that's where it goes. And it is downstairs away from all the sleeping areas.
Yep. That's great. And people will have phone-free zones, or they'll have charging ports and stations, like again, nuance, right? Anything that works for your family.
Yeah.
Again, these are low-hanging fruit things, right? I think one thing I would like to, because the question I get all the time is, well, what about parental controls, right? And which ones do you recommend? How do I do it? And here's what I am going to invite people to do instead of thinking about parental controls, because in my experience, and I'm being cheeky here, I say I don't recommend parental controls, I recommend parenting. But I do recognize that persuasive design piece makes it really unfair. I think the fear I have about parental controls is we think of them as this, magic solution that will solve our problems. It does not. It will not. Kids are still going to ask for screen time. So again, if this works for your family and it's not a problem, great, keep doing what you're doing. But do not rely on them solely. So the two questions I get asked all the time are, how much is too much screen time and what parental controls do you recommend? And I want to invite you to think about two different questions. Do I know what my child is doing online? And do I have a good relationship with them? And the research behind this, it's the Gallup and IFS study from last year, backs this up 100%. Knowing the answer to the second questions is actually far more protective for our children than limiting the total number of hours or trying to monitor them through a device or and I have a whole blog post about 10 reasons I don't recommend parental control, which again, if they work for you, fine. But I think we just have to know what we're getting into when we dive down that path.
Listen, a lock on the refrigerator is not as effective long-term or short-term as teaching somebody to recognize their own hunger signals.
Yes, exactly. That's a great metaphor.
Right. And to feed them whole nutritious food. Okay, great.
Right.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I do hear that a lot. Like, oh, YouTube has parental controls. Well,
I call it digital whack-a-mole because
that's right.
Minute you try to block something, it's going to pop up and you will spend the rest of your life trying to monitor and block stuff and never, ever reach the bottom. There's a reason that we get sucked into bottomless scroll. There is no bottom. So
that is something I experience that daily. Honestly, I'll just see what's new. Well, there's so much that's new. I couldn't possibly keep up. And at some point I come up for air and I realize, oh, there is no bottom to this feed.
I know. There's a great quote that trying to get information from the internet is like trying to take a drink of water from a fire hose.
Yeah. I totally,
There you go. Yeah.
We're going to wrap this up here. I would like to publicly invite you back to talk about teens specifically.
Yes, I would love that. Yes, because I got lots to say about teens. It's a different challenge.
It's a different challenge for sure.
Yeah, and I always say it's the parents of children 0 to 10 who need me and the parents of 10 and up who find me. And so how you respond to that, and it's, again, I'm an optimist. I don't think it's ever too late. I think there are always things we can do, but yes, I would love to do that.
That would be amazing. All right. If people want to find your book, and I'll link to it, but if they want to find out more about you, how do they do that?
Well, irony is not lost on me that I have social media channels. So I'm on the major platforms under the Screen Time Consultant, and my website is thescreentimeconsultant.com. And you can buy my book anywhere it's sold, including the big places. And I always recommend independent stores and libraries to plug those as opportunities for supporting them. but yeah, I'm always interested to hear from parents. I do school presentations as well, and I do one-on-one parent coaching for those who really do want to do this hard work. But it's yeah, it's not easy.
Amazing. Emily Cherkin, what a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. You're so welcome. Thank you for having me.